Today we're speaking with New York labor lawyer Abdul K. Hassan about severance pay. Mr. Hassan, what is severance pay?
Well, severance pay refers to a variety of payments which are due when the employment relationship is severed or ended. But generally, the word severance is used to a specific type of a variety of wages which might be due to the employee.
Is an employee entitled to severance pay?
No, in terms of the most common type of severance pay, which most people understand when the term severance is used, there is no right under the law to severance pay. However, if the employer has a policy or a practice of paying severance, then the law requires the employer to follow the policy and to pay the employee severance if the employee qualifies for severance under that policy. Now, employees should know that there's a federal law called ERISA, and there's also local labor laws which govern the payment of severance. And if there's a severance plan or policy, the employee would be entitled to a copy of that policy. So if the employee is terminated, the employee should consult the employer, write to the plan administrator and request a copy. Then the employee can read that plan to see if the employee qualifies, and if the employee qualifies, how much severance the employee is entitled to under the circumstances. If the plan administrator fails to give the employee a copy of the plan or fails to give the employee the wages, the severance wages the employee is entitled to, the employee can bring a lawsuit in federal or state court, depending on the circumstances, to recover the severance. Now, generally, when severance is provided for in a severance plan, it is given to the employee if the employee is laid off as opposed to being fired or terminated. However, there are circumstances in which the employer might falsely claim that the employee was fired or terminated instead of being laid off. So there might be a dispute and hence some litigation over whether the employee was actually laid off or whether the employee was terminated. Now, sometimes these lawsuits are significant because the amount of severance can be significant as well. If, let's say, the employer provides for, let's say, a month of severance for every year that an employee works for the employer, and you have an employee that works for 30 years, as you can imagine, that amount of severance can be extremely significant and may justify fighting the employer and filing a lawsuit against the employer to recover over. Now, the other thing that employees should know about severance, usually when an employee accepts severance payments, the employer may insist on a release of all claims. So the employee should be very careful to consult a lawyer to make sure that they're not releasing claims which are worth more than the amount of severance payments they're receiving from the employer.
Is an employee entitled to payment for unused vacation upon layoff or termination?
The law itself doesn't require payment for vacation which is not used, but it will depend on the agreement or the policy of the employer. Here again, if the employer has a policy of paying for unused vacation time, then the law requires, especially here in New York, that the employer honor that policy and pay for the accrued vacation time. Now, some employer may have a use it or lose it policy. If you don't use the time, you lose it upon termination. However, employees should pay attention to the situation in which they are prevented from using the vacation time because the employer wanted them to work. In that case, you can make a strong argument that even if the employer has a use it or lose it policy, that you're still entitled to payment for the unused vacation time.
Is an employee entitled to payment for unused personal and sick days upon layoff or termination?
Well, personal and sick days, the need for them are usually triggered under certain specific circumstances, such as a death in the family or the sickness of the employee. So if those circumstances do not exist, the need for personal and sick days also will not exist. So as a general rule and the general practice based upon my experience is that employees are not compensated for unused personal or sick days. However, once again, if the employer wants to pay you for these days or if it has a policy of paying for these days, there's nothing preventing the employer from paying you for them.
Is an employee entitled to notice pay if the employee is laid off or terminated?
Generally, no. Of course, if the employer has a policy of giving notice pay, well, then it has to honor that with respect to the terminated employee. But the law doesn't require it. There are a few exceptions, however, such as under the Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act, the WARN Act. It's a federal law, but it's also state equivalence. Under that act, generally, if you have a plant closing or a mass layoff, and the employer is of a certain size that is covered under the law, then you generally require to get 60 days notice. And if the employer doesn't give you 60 days notice, then you can recover wages for whatever period of the 60 days you did not receive the notice for.
Is an employee entitled to payment for unused compensatory time upon layoff or termination?
Well, comp time or compensatory time refers to the situation where an employee may work beyond his or her schedule and is given a day off for the additional work which is done in a given week. I think there's a strong argument that if you already put in the extra work, that the comp time is actually the equivalent of wages for the work you've already done, and therefore you've earned that comp time, and that upon termination, regardless of the policy of the employer, you should be paid for that comp time. Of course, there is no clear definitive rule, but I think that is a strong argument that can be made in these circumstances to recover comp time. Also, if the employer is giving comp time, there might be an issue of whether the employer is violating the overtime rules, and you should be sure to consult with a lawyer to ascertain whether the overtime rules are being violated with respect to your rights.
Is an employee entitled to payment for unpaid commissions upon layoff or termination?
Well, if the commissions are earned, then yes, the employee would be entitled to payment of the commissions which the employee earns. Usually the commission payments would lag the normal payment of wages. Sometimes companies would pay commissions several months after a sale is consummated. So if under the agreement with the employer, the commissions are earned, then those are wages which are due to the employee, and the employee is entitled to the payment of those commission wages.
Is an employee entitled to payment for unpaid bonuses upon layoff or termination?
Well, bonuses are generally, in the classic sense, bonuses are generally a matter of discretion. However, it may be in certain circumstances that what is called a bonus is actually wages which are earned by the employee. So don't be fooled by the title given to the payment. In other words, because they label it as a bonus does not mean it's a bonus in the classic sense, or does not mean it's a discretionary bonus. So these are issues that a lawyer may litigate or may have a difference of opinion on, and may be the basis for bringing a claim against the employer.
When an employee is terminated, when is the last payment of wages due?
Well, it's generally due the payday following the pay period in which the employee was terminated. And here in New York, the employee can request that the last payment of wages be mailed to him or her.
How important is it to consult an attorney?
Oh, it's very important. There are lots of rules and lots of details which I cannot cover in a short interview like this. So it's very important for an employee who is terminated to consult an attorney and to get an individualized assessment of his or her circumstances in the context of the law to determine what wages, severance wages and other wages may be owed at the time of termination.
We've been speaking with New York labor lawyer Mr. Abdul Hassan. Mr. Hassan, thanks for answering our questions today.
You're welcome.